Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to begin by recognizing that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territory of Wasanich peoples, and I am honored to represent Saanich Gulf Islands and to the Wasanich indigenous peoples of this land. Haishka Siam. I am also going to apologize to my friends, my francophone friends. Je veux parler toujours un peu en français.
I will speak in French a bit, but the issue is that every time you switch languages, you lose a little bit of speaking time. That's why I tend to speak only in English, so I'll be speaking English today. Apologies.
That's the amount of time you lose to change the channel, so I wanted to apologize to francophone friends. The somber news received during the time of today's speech, I want to acknowledge that from the moment when our Honorable Minister for Finance stood to present where we are as a country right now, in British Columbia, Dr. Bonnie Henry presented the somber news that we had a new record broken this weekend. 46 British Columbians died. That's a new record. And over the weekend, we have 2,364 new cases. Records were also broken in Alberta. So I take to heart very much what our Honourable Minister of Finance, the Deputy Prime Minister of this country, said. This is a hard time. COVID is in a second wave and it is surging. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we have to try to work together. We have to hold on, which we seem to have already lost in this Parliament, a sense that we're all in it together and that Canadians want to see us working together. I also want to acknowledge that a bit of history was made today, and that is, as the first woman to take the floor to deliver a speech since the Minister of Finance did. I acknowledge my friend from the bloc from Pontigny got to put forward a question, but as the first woman to deliver a speech since the Honourable Finance Minister, I want to acknowledge that this is the first time in Canadian history that a finance minister has presented an economic update and that finance minister is a woman. It happens that our first female finance minister also delivered her speech to the highest number of women members of parliament. With the two recent by-elections, we are now 100 women out of 338 members. Not enough, mind you, but a historic breakthrough. And it's in a spirit of knowing that women believe we can accomplish more when we work together that I want to acknowledge the recent leadership on a number of files of the new leader of the Green Party of Canada. As fortune, luck would have it, and I certainly wish that there were more women leaders of other federal political parties, but Annamie Paul has replaced me as the Green Party leader, and yet again, the only woman leader at the federal level. And Annamie Paul, in the Green values tradition, has been on the COVID front saying we have to work together. We can't allow this to become partisan. And I know it has already become quite partisan in the House of Commons, and I would urge my colleagues from all sides of the House to put Canadians first and to recognize that we can score points off each other later. For now, let's try to work together and keep the volume a little lower out of respect for people who are across this country afraid of catching COVID, afraid of older relatives catching COVID. In my case, as my daughter teaches school in the Burnaby school system, I pay particular attention to an economic statement that says we'll get more and better ventilation in our public spaces because I remain worried. I want to reference another very wise woman before I turn to the details of the speech, and that's Margaret Atwood. And it's one of the themes in our debates in Parliament. It's a theme, really, that runs through the Finance Minister's fall economic statement. And that's this question of whether in a COVID emergency, we can also be cognizant of a climate emergency. Margaret Atwood was asked this summer in a virtual speech she was giving to the Union of British Columbia Municipalities if she was concerned that because of COVID, climate crisis had been pushed to the back burner. And Margaret Atwood said words to the effect of, well, I don't know about you, but my stove at home has 2 front burners. So I want to make sure that as we build back better, as we look at economic recovery, we continue to remember that the climate emergency hasn't gone away. And we must ensure that every step we take is consistent with the kind of action we take as grown-ups in a climate emergency, who recognize that nothing has gotten better while we turn our attention to COVID. Now, looking at the fall economic statement, I have to say it predicts in some ways the path forward, and it gives us some quite substantial hints about what we may see in the next budget. We don't know when the next budget will be, but clearly there's been a lot of hard work going on here. I did mean to say this earlier, forgive me. Everybody's been working very hard. I just want to acknowledge that. In Finance Canada, they've been working very hard. I think Liberals, Conservatives, NDP, Bloc, all of us as members of Parliament have been working very hard, but goodness knows so is the civil service. So have the people, whether their efforts are inadequate or not as we judge them today, who've been securing vaccines for Canadians, who've been securing PPE, who've been trying to figure out how we pay for this, how we fund it, how we go forward. I just want to stop and acknowledge everyone's hard work, and I want to thank the Minister of Finance for hers. Now, where we are here now and what needs to be done better. Certainly, I am very pleased to see that we may, in fact, at long last, and as the Minister of Finance's speech noted, there's been a generation of waiting for a decent childcare. Maybe the fact the Minister of Finance has had to stay home and take care of her own sick children, we might, in fact, finally get to a proper support in this country for early learning and childcare. But we are told we can see something in budget 2021. We will not be satisfied with less than a full program for childcare for Canadians. But I'm feeling more optimistic than I did before I heard the speech. I am pleased that we saw recognition in this speech of the huge amount of work that needs to be done on reconciliation. A reference to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry and to meeting some of those calls for action is important. We need to meet all the calls for action. We certainly are looking at improvements in contact tracing and testing. We need to do more and better to make sure that we can, at-home testing would be great. Quicker results would be great. And I note this on the vaccine front, and I hope this is offered in the spirit. It's offered in the spirit for sure of collaborative and practical thinking about where we are on vaccines. Angus Reid polling tells us that 39% of Canadians say they want the vaccine as soon as it's ready. 38% say they'd like to wait and see. People want to make sure that it's tested and safe and can be used safely. I'd like to encourage the government to think about vaccines in relation to making sure that we all agree who the frontline workers are, who needs to get it first. That we recognize that it wouldn't be a really wise global course for Canada to hog all the vaccines so every Canadian is vaccinated before, say, frontline healthcare workers in other countries. We need to take a sensible approach and make sure the vaccine is rolled out and that those who are in the front lines get it first, and that we recognize that we're all working together to ensure safety and reliability in the vaccines that are delivered. I hear concerns from my constituents on both sides of this, those who want it quickly and those who say, wait a minute, I want to make sure it's tested properly. I'm very encouraged to hear more for youth in this budget. We let our youth down badly last summer. We need to increase the number of summer jobs as is promised in this speech. And we're very encouraged to see, as my honorable colleague, the member from Fredericton, asked in the House, I think just a few days ago, will the government agree that we should at least eliminate interest charges on student debt? It's very encouraging to see that that will be done for 1 year, but let's keep doing it. And let's work towards abolishing tuition and giving our kids a good start in life without emerging with massive student debts, which unfortunately remains the case for so many of our young people. We can do better for our youth. I was also really pleased to see the references to more pharmacare development, but it's very slow. We need to see a full pharmacare plan, and we need to see it soon. It was encouraging to see a recognition that the natural course of market share between fossil fuels and renewables, the economic statement notes that the shift that was occurring before COVID hit, we were already seeing a massive shift of investment away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. This economic statement confirms that that shift is happening, that the oil sector is not likely to recover, that the share of renewable energy as affordable and reliable is only going to increase. This is good and encouraging news and should underpin where we go when we look at measures related to climate. So let me turn my attention now to the other emergency, to the climate emergency. You know, since COVID hit, there have been more than 100 climate disasters around the world that have collectively claimed 410,000 lives around the world from climate disasters at a time that, you know, more than 1,400,000 roughly have died of COVID. But the climate disasters and the climate emergency will continue apace, and there is no vaccine against a climate emergency. We need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and do so very quickly. So I was encouraged to see so much that really emerges from green strategy and Green Party policy, but really I'm optimistic when I see the commitment to eco-energy retrofits for buildings, for homes. It's described as being for homes. We need to extend it to all buildings. We need to make sure that commercial and institutional buildings can also make these investments in energy efficiency retrofits. They cost less per dollar of carbon averted, and they create more jobs right across the country in all the skilled trades, in carpenters and electricians and in insulating, and it's a fantastic way to invest that builds our economies back at the local level, also helping all of those local hardware and supply for buildings, carpet, all of the elements of eco-energy retrofits builds our local economies. Very encouraged to see better infrastructure for zero-emission vehicles. Yes to tree planting. Yes, please, and please make sure that we're planting in indigenous species, that we're getting into those areas that have been burned off due to forest fires and are not recovering because the fires burned so hot in areas in the Thompson River Valley and Fraser. We've seen so many, the Elephant Hill fire, for example, in British Columbia, years later is not recovering. We need to plant trees in those areas as part of our strategy to recover and protect our wild salmon. These things are interconnected, and yes, it's a very important way to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. I hope that in the budget we'll also see, because we saw Indigenous peoples referenced as part of tree planting strategies, let's also make sure the Indigenous guardian programs are expanded and properly funded. Very encouraged to see that peat and grasslands and other parts of the nature-based solutions to the climate crisis are being referenced here. And for the first time, it looks like there's going to be substantial money, but it doesn't look like enough, I'll be honest. But farmers are a big part of the climate solution. Regenerative management of our soils, making sure there are crop covers all the time so that the soils don't blow away. This is actually a significant part of carbon sequestration and should be properly funded as a way that helps our farming community at the same time that it reduces greenhouse gases. So it's good to see nature-based solutions playing a role in where the government appears to be going for the future of climate action. Public transit is terribly important. I must note that early reaction from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to this economic statement is that they are disappointed that there's not enough for their budget planning at the municipal level right across Canada. I flag that for the minister and for the government to make sure that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is brought in as a very close partner. They've got solid data. I've always been impressed with their work, and partnering with municipalities has served many federal governments very well. Going back to Stephen Harper's government in 2008, their infrastructure programs were rolled out thanks to our municipal order of government. So we can do more there. But I do want to raise a concern. Almost every reference to public transit that I've seen and including this financial statement, focuses on urban public transit. We have a crisis in Canada, and it was flagged in the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, of a lack of public transportation to get from A to B in rural areas. The loss of Greyhound, the loss of Saskatchewan bus services, the loss throughout the Maritimes of bus service between areas that are more remote is a real crisis. And I hope as we're building back better, we will look in the budget when it comes out next, whatever it's going to come out in 2021, funding to ensure that people in more remote areas have access to affordable, safe public transit. So young Indigenous women and girls don't have to hitchhike. So our seniors don't have to get behind the wheel of a car when they don't want to drive at night because there's no other way to get from A to B. We can do better. I was pleased to see the references to the interties for our electricity grid. It is important, as the financial statement points out, that we go off coal and decarbonize our electricity grid. But just as the member for Nanaimo Ladysmith just mentioned, I want to mention, it mentions going off coal, but it doesn't mention that shifting from coal to fracked gas, to burn fracked gas to produce electricity, doesn't produce major savings in greenhouse gases. It's a wash. So we must ban fracking and stop thinking that fracked natural gas plays any role in a solution to the climate crisis. So too, this financial statement mentions nuclear reactors, so-called small and medium reactors, which exist on paper. They're a proposal, a marketing strategy for a dying industry. Don't put good money after bad. We've wasted billions of dollars in this country on a failed nuclear reactor strategy. Calling them small and modular doesn't make them a good place to put money. You should invest in things that per dollar invested reduce the most greenhouse gases and create the most jobs. And if you keep that in mind, and also the shortest amount of time between investment and return, if you keep those three things in mind, you wouldn't put any money in nuclear at all, particularly in something that is a design project on paper and doesn't exist in reality. Now, what else do we need? What else do we need in the next budget? And this has been flagged by a number of colleagues from different parties, particularly the New Democrats and the Greens have mentioned this before, but we need to increase revenue flows. We need to know that we've got the money to continue to have, and I applaud the minister for putting forward that we're going to need at least a 3-year economic stimulus package to bring back our economy. Come on, let's bring in a wealth tax. There's the billionaires have made $53 billion since the pandemic started. Let's tax that wealth and make sure that Canadians can afford our pharmacare plans, our child care plans, our dental care plans for low-income Canadians, helping our students, taking care of our seniors. We need to have a wealth tax. I've flagged that we need to have a guaranteed livable income. When we look at, and this is referenced in the statement, by the way, I think it's at page 79, there's reference to the fact that so many of our frontline healthcare workers are low income and in precarious jobs. That's just not good enough. There are essential workers. They've been working so hard and risking their lives in long-term care homes. These frontline workers are so low paid, it's just a scandal. Let's look at guaranteed livable income so that we know no one falls below the poverty line and that every worker in Canada keeps what they earn on top of their guaranteed livable income so that they don't face insecurity, housing insecurity, healthcare insecurity. They are protected. So we need to look at guaranteed livable income and bring it into being as well as pharmacare, as well as childcare, as well as knowing that housing is a right and every Canadian has a roof over their head. We need to look at doing more in taxing the digital giants. It is encouraging what the Minister for Finance said, but as other colleagues have noted, if they're not paying their taxes, just GST and HST, for more than a year, that's not good enough. We need to start regulating and taxing the digital giants, whether they are Airbnbs or Amazon or the Googles that are threatening existing Canadian industries, whether they're small businesses up and down our main streets of our towns or our newspapers or our broadcasters. We're starting to recognize the threat, but there's more we must do. Now, I noted it was sort of amusing in the questions and answers. My colleague, the Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith, asked the Leader of the Official Opposition if he had any thoughts on the government's moving towards clean, green energy. And the Leader of the Official Opposition responded, which I guess makes the Conservatives' position clear, that he's really proud of the Keystone Pipeline. Okay, so let me get to this question of fossil fuels and how we're funding them. It's time, it's more than time to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Stephen Harper promised to stop subsidizing fossil fuels in 2009. The Liberals promised it again in their platform in 2015, and fossil fuel subsidies have gone up. One way of ignoring that reality is to have trouble defining what a fossil fuel subsidy is. And Finance Canada told the Auditor General they weren't sure how you would define it. Here's how you define it. Anytime you put public money into producing energy out of fossil fuels and expanding that resource, you are subsidizing fossil fuels, which means stop subsidizing fracking. Stop subsidizing LNG, which is being subsidized by the federal and British Columbia governments, by the way. Stop spending money on pipelines. The Trans Mountain Pipeline is 100% owned by the people of Canada. The minimum expenditure that is now committed is $12 billion. It could be far more than that, as my friend from Burnaby, New Westminster has noted. Cancel the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. We'll still own the existing pipeline. No one's worrying about having, well, it was a waste of money to buy it, but it's operating. It brings crude into Burnaby for the last remaining refinery. No problem with that. It'll be phased out over time, but stop putting public money into expanding greenhouse gases. And for heaven's sakes, Prime Minister, pick up the phone, call President-elect Joe Biden and say, good for you for canceling Keystone. It's a good idea. What can we do to put our heads together using, we were very pleased to see it, a border adjustment tax on carbon. Let's put together a continental package of Canada and the U.S. and Mexico together saying we're going to carbon price and we're going to have a border adjustment to protect us from imports from countries that aren't pricing carbon properly. We have an incredible opportunity with an incoming U.S. administration having appointed John Kerry as their climate czar. This appears to be a government that's serious. They're already ahead of us in reducing greenhouse gases, even after 4 years of Trump. That's how poorly we've been performing. Let's seize the opportunity to call President-elect Joe Biden and say, we're with you. Let's cancel all the fossil fuel subsidies and let's both countries ban fracking, because fracked natural gas produces methane, and that methane is a powerful greenhouse gas. And if we're going to preserve a livable world for our kids, we have to keep both issues on the front burner. So I will be digging into this report, as I know Annemie Paul, Green Party leader, and members of our caucus, the member for Fredericton and Nanaimo Ladysmith, will be working through all of the details in this very detailed document. I'm encouraged by much of what we see. I think we will be increasingly clear on what's missing. But please, let's make this the turning point it really can be. Post-COVID, Canada can emerge as a country that actually gets our act together, that becomes a more, where our productivity index goes up, where our competitiveness goes up, where our job creation goes up, because we will not be wasting any more money in dying industries that not only are dying, but threaten us. We have to put our kids and our recovery at the heart of everything we do as a nation. Climate emergency and fairness in the world, eliminating poverty in Canada, eliminating racism in Canada, and taking a stand globally so that we help around the world delivering on all the sustainable development goals. We can do this. We've got a really amazing opportunity, and I plead with all my colleagues to think of this as a moment where we stop thinking about question period as how can I make the other guy look bad? But how do we together make Canada look good? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the former leader of the Green Party can never be accused of not being bold. And I always appreciate to the degree in which she's very forthright in terms of her opinions. And, on the issue of whether it's the pipelines or fracking, very much understand, disagree in part with what the member is saying, but I understand what she's saying and why she is saying it. And the question that I have for her is in regards to the LNG project. If she could, what would she do with that specific project, given where it's at today? She talks about the negative impacts of fracking. I don't quite understand what she would do with LNG today if, in fact, she had the power to do something on it.
Honourable member, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I should wait to be called upon. To my honourable friend from Winnipeg, it's the liquefied natural gas is, when it comes from conventional natural gas, a viable alternative. And we used to call it a transition fuel when I was back in Sierra Club in the early 1990s. Nobody in the environmental movement calls it a transition fuel anymore, because what we're dealing with is not conventional natural gas. We are fracking. Fracked natural gas has the same carbon footprint as coal. So it represents a major lie to tell British Columbians, for instance, as our premier tells us, that this is going to be wonderful because they'll burn it in China instead of coal, and that will somehow help. The global atmosphere doesn't care where the carbon comes from. Carbon from fracking and the methane that's released does just as much damage to the atmosphere as burning coal in China. Cancel it and put our money where we and the fact that this is being heavily subsidized for a group of foreign corporations is a scandal. Most of the manufacturing, by the way, is taking place in the People's Republic of China to build what will then be shipped over to British Columbia. Cancel it. It's a massive subsidy for jobs in the People's Republic of China. Let's put the jobs in Canada and produce renewable energy here.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I just was wondering if the former leader of the Green Party could clarify something for me. Earlier tonight, the member from Port Nanaimo Ladysmith said that he was excited about the geothermal drilling activity that happened in Saskatchewan that resulted in a gusher of a well. The thing is, that well was actually drilled using fracking. So we just heard her talk about how much she has a disdain for fracking, but yet her colleague was talking glowingly about a well that was actually drilled using fracking. So what is it? Do you support fracking or do you not?
Again, I want to remind the honourable members to place their questions through the Speaker, not directly to each other. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Well, I'm glad to have the question for the honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands. Let's be clear. When you're fracking you're fracturing the bedrock for natural gas, and you're actually fracking the gas, vast amounts of methane are released, but there are transferable skills. People who drilled wells for oil can drill wells for geothermal, and that's what happened here. This is a huge find. It's really important to recognize actually 10% of all the abandoned wells through Saskatchewan and Alberta have potential to be tapped for geothermal. So let's look at the opportunities transitioning away from fossil fuels and into renewables. Geothermal has huge potential. And those wells at depth, 10% of them that are already abandoned, that are a liability on the books of Saskatchewan and Alberta, actually have potential to produce green electricity. And we support green electricity. We don't support fracking.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Manicouagan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Saanich Gulf Islands for her answer to her reply to the economic statement. I believe that she, like the Bloc Québécois, would find that there was a lack of vision in the economic statement. She talked about forestry and carbon capturing and greener energy sources. And I tabled a proposal that involves forestry, which is an economic pillar of the Quebec economy and the Canadian economy. I wonder if that's a promising area. Are there any developments in research? Does she know of anything that is good about forestry for the future? The Honourable Member for Saanich. Yes, I'd like to thank my colleague from Manicouagan. I believe that the Bloc's approach is so close to the Green Party's approach. We need to invest in renewable energy, not in oil pipelines and fossil fuels. And thank you for the question. Questions and comments?
The Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to my colleague for her speech. We've been talking a lot about some of the disappointing aspects of this economic update, but the most biggest disappointment as far as I'm concerned, and she's been talking about bold actions that need to be taken, is that this federal government is not stepping up on what has been immense levels of profit and increase in wealth during this pandemic. Billionaires have received about $53 billion in new wealth in Canada. We've seen the web giants making a huge level of profits, and they don't pay corporate taxes. So my question to the honourable member is very simple. Does she feel it's important that the federal government actually take measures to increase revenues so that we're not in a situation where the federal government then cuts supports that are vitally needed for people because they haven't put in place the revenue side of the equation?
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
And thanks to my friend from New Westminster Burnaby. Actually, I referenced the same figure in my speech. The fact that the billionaire class has raked in another $53 billion since COVID began is a shocker. We do need a wealth tax. We also, I think we should look at the profits of the large commercial banks. Our large commercial banks are taxed less in Canada than in some of the competitor nations, such as in the United States. So we're looking at the banks have had record profits. The billionaires have had record profits. Goodness knows the digital companies, as we approach Christmas season, we endorse, the campaign not to buy anything from Amazon, because those big offshore digital giants are eroding our bedrock small businesses across Canada, whether they're hotels affected by Airbnbs or newspapers affected by the news services where they don't even pay for what they're getting. So I'm very much in favor of us looking at future revenue sources, and let's continue to push the Minister of Finance. At some point, we have to find a new source of revenue. We can't imagine going through the kind of austerity programs that I remember, and that I know he remembers from the early 90s, when we lost something like 30% of our hospital beds in a misguided approach to cut spending, and it really hurt us long term. So we have to be prepared to find other sources of revenue so that we can keep building the kind of society that we know we can. We're a wealthy country. We just have to get our priorities right.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me the opportunity on the last question for tonight. The question to the Honourable former leader of the Green Party is, I've never heard her talk about nuclear energy or nuclear producing energy as a solution toward more greener or to reduce gas emissions. I would like to hear her comment on this specific topic. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I think the nuclear promise for Canada was best summed up years ago by commentator Fred Nelman, who said, nuclear is a future technology whose time has passed. There is no future for nuclear as part of our solution to the climate crisis. It's very capital intensive. It is not labor intensive. It reduces very few greenhouse gases compared to the big winners, which are, of course, energy efficiency investments, renewable energy investments, outpace nuclear so clearly that you'd only put money in nuclear if you were deluded and addicted to the technology. And I'm afraid there's still some people in Natural Resources Canada who fall in that category.